A man uses his intellect to develop AI and other companies' technology in hopes of bringing his dead wife back to life. But when he finally learns the truth about the accident that killed her, will he be able to accept it? Let's find out in the movie. In the year 2038, a man named George Almore is hired by Artisan Robotics to create a true human equivalent AI system. Stationed in an old facility in the forest of Japan, he spends his 3 years perfecting his AI and android prototypes. One snowy day, George is taking a jog in the forest. While doing so, J2, George's second prototype, monitors his movements. The two are testing if the security system can detect George with him posing as an intruder. Because the facility is old, its security system needs some fixing. This is what George is working on aside from his actual work as a researcher. J2 serves as George's assistant because she has a better AI than George's first prototype, J1. When George gets back to the facility, the two visit J1 and he opens the TV for her to watch cartoons. There, J2 shares with him that she had a dream last night about the two of them driving together. Hearing this, George asks if she dreams or remembers anything else, to which J2 says none. But she adds that when she woke up, she felt sad. George just tells her that dreams do it sometimes and orders her to prepare J1 for the assessment. Afterward, he goes to the living room to talk to his late wife, Jules, using the archive. The archive allows the dead to communicate with their family by putting their deceased body in a machine and keeping their consciousness intact. Yet, this communication is only allotted for a limited time until the archive of the dead person expires. George and Jules talk about how much they miss each other. However, she doesn't want this kind of communication anymore because it is hard for her. After telling George that she loves him, Jules ends the call. A little later, his employer finally arrives at the facility. But to his surprise, it is only Simone, the VP of International Development of Artisan Robotics. According to her, the assessment was canceled. She only goes to the facility to remind George that he must finish fixing the security system before his contract ends. Also, Simone notices that the company is sending armed response units to all their facilities. George doesn't want one in his place, reasoning that the facility he's in is very hidden. But he cannot do anything about it, especially since it has been 2.5 years on his contract and he still cannot give them anything aside from J1. Calling his first prototype ugly, Simone compared J1 to her own robot, which is more advanced than George's. After the meeting, J2 arrives and states that she doesn't like Simone, calling her a bitch. George agrees, and that's why he doesn't want to reveal J2 to them. He's sure that when they find out about her, they will rip her apart and conduct a study on her brain. J2 then consoles J1 and tells her that she's not ugly. Right after that, George goes to his workshop, unveiling a third android prototype in progress. This prototype looks more like a human. At this moment, it is revealed that George is planning to put his wife's consciousness to his third prototype, J3. Without him noticing, J2 is watching him. The next day, George and J2 are working on the security system in the forest again. J2 takes the opportunity to ask why he's not allowing her to help him in the workshop anymore. She is showing signs of jealousy towards J3, thinking that George wants to make another prototype like her, but better. George gets pissed and insists that he's not replacing J2. Soon enough, George finishes creating J3's brain and wakes her up. But to his surprise, J3 hysterically screams, so he has no other choice but to put her in hibernation. A little later, George is about to go out when he sees a dog in the garage. After shooing the dog away, he orders the facility's AI to close the door, but there is an error. When George checks on the power system of the garage, he discovers a new component inside the panel that he didn't put there before. George asks J2 about it, who says she knows nothing about it. But he knows she's lying and reminds her that they only have limited resources, so she cannot just change any component without notifying him. Then, all of a sudden, the house AI alerts George that there are vehicles requesting entry to the facility. George checks on them using the facility's camera, and a man introduces himself as Vincent Sinclair from Archive Systems Incorporated. Hearing this, George immediately orders J1 and J2 to stay put in their base and not move until the men are gone. After that, he accompanies Vincent and his men to the living room where Jules' archive is. According to Vincent, they got notified that Jules is starting to transition to somnolence. Yet George insists that his wife is not yet going away. At this time, Vincent tells him that his associate named Melvin will need to run a few tests on the archive. When Melvin asks about the communication line, George tells him that it is clear, although he cannot connect with her when he is trying to call. The only time they talk is when she's the one calling him. After that, Melvin begins inspecting Jules' archive. Just a minute later, he discovers that the security seals in the archive have been broken and notifies Vincent about it. When Vincent checks on it, George tells Melvin that his analysis must be wrong. But Melvin stands by what he discovered, saying that George violated the policy of archive, which should never be opened. Because of this, they will have to terminate the contract and prepare Jules for burial. Hearing this, George curses at him, and the tension starts to rise as Melvin alerts their security. Not wanting to have any trouble, Vincent calms the two men down, saying that it's just a misunderstanding. Owning up to the mistake, Vincent and his men leave the place. Once they are gone, George goes straight to J3 and wakes her up. This time, she's calmer and more relaxed. But as she gets confused once again, she starts panicking. George is about to put her back in hibernation, but J3 begs him not to. J3 asks why she can't remember things, to which George says her AI is just starting to adjust and build itself. The next day, J2 finds a robot keychain that kind of looks like her near the waterfalls. Concurrently, George starts testing J3's taste receptors and memory strength, and she passes the tests without a problem. Next, he makes her wear VR goggles to test her empathy by making her play with a dog. Shortly after, J2 arrives and says she likes that game, surprising J3. She then hands a different component to George, saying that the one he's looking for is not yet ready, but he insists on J2 to get the component he needs. Not a minute has passed and J1 arrives next. George introduces her to J3, who realizes that the three of them are all different compared to other robots. Just then, George reveals to her that all of them are equipped with human equivalent AI, and since the creation of J1, he had made a lot of progress. Showing her a brain graph, he explains that J1 has the mind of a 5-year-old kid. That is the reason why she likes watching cartoons and needs to be taken care of most of the time. On the other hand, J2 has the mind of a 16-year-old kid. This means that she's more mature than J1, but still not mature enough for George's plan. Yet, this allows her to be a good assistant to George. And lastly, J3 manages to develop the brain of a full-grown adult. She also has more human-like actions and demeanors. In the meantime, J2 is watching them from the security camera and her jealousy is rising. The next morning, George sets out again to fix the security system. Before he leaves, he gives J3 a radio so she can contact him if she needs to. J2 wants to go with him, but George just tells her to stay home and look after J1. While he works on one of the towers, J3 radios him and says the lights keep on turning off and on in the facility. Scared, she asks him to come back. Upon looking over the facility, he sees through his binoculars that a drone is watching over the place. Seeing this, he immediately goes back to the facility. Later that night, George goes out to meet with a risk assessor named Mr. Tag. Not wanting him to go inside the facility, George meets him in a restaurant. There, Tag reminds George that whatever he does, he should never defy the company. He then shows George a photo of him sleeping that was taken 2 nights ago. With this, George has no other option but to take Artisan robotics seriously. Before Tag leaves, he leaves him a briefcase and reminds him that he should only open it in case of emergency. The scene then changes from George driving back to the facility to the moment he is driving with Jules. There, he tells her about the job offering at Artisan Robotics. Jules gets so happy for her husband after hearing the news. The only problem is that they will need to move to Japan where the facility is located. This makes Jules speechless for a moment. Noticing that her mood changes, George tells Jules that he can always refuse if she doesn't want to go. But suddenly, a car comes straight flying in their direction. George gets awakened from his nightmare of how his wife died. Just in time, House alerts him of an intruder in the residential area. Picking up a cricket bat, George slowly and carefully makes his way there. After checking on the residential area and finding nothing, he goes straight to his workshop. Unfortunately, he discovers that J3 is missing. Due to that, he immediately gets the briefcase in his car. To George's surprise, he sees a gun inside and the facility suddenly gets on lockdown. When Tag appears on screen, George realizes that he's the one that enabled the lockdown protocol. He asks what happened, but George lies to him, saying that he just opened the case to see what's inside. Because of this, Tag reminds him to never open it again unless there is a real emergency. Morning comes and George begins looking for J3. The scene transitions from him looking for his prototype to his past self talking to his wife. They are talking about the archive and how it manages to keep the dead alive so they can continue communicating with their loved ones. While George is amazed by the concept, Jules feels weird and uncomfortable about it. Then, one night, the couple argue because George registers them to the archive program even though Jules doesn't want it. In the end, Jules asks him to cancel it, to which George agrees. Going back to the present, George uses a drone to search more effectively, but still cannot find J3. When he heads back to the facility, he sees J1 waiting for him outside in the rain. Seeing this, he immediately guides J1 inside. J2 shows up shortly after and asks if he found J3 already. George says no and starts looking for his night kit before he continues searching. J2 then apologizes that she's not yet enough for him. But George calmly says he's replacing no one and all of them are family. Even though J3 will be completed soon, he will still look after J1 and J2. A little later, while George is gathering his things, J3 falls from one of the compartments above him. When she wakes up, she screams at George, telling him that she finally knows about Jules and what he's really doing to them. George calms her down and apologizes, reasoning that he's only doing it because he cannot live without his wife. At this time, J3 demands to learn all of the truth from him. After putting her back in the workshop, George explains that he extracted part of Jules' memory from the technology of the archive and then used it as the base of J3's brain, making her brain contain a biochemical element. He tried to do the same with J1 and J2, but as he mentioned earlier, their brains stopped evolving at the human equivalent age of 5 and 16. Just then, George asks J3 what happened to her. According to J3, J2 forcefully took her to Jules' archive. She tried to fight back, but when they lost their balance, J3 blacked out. Hearing this, George confronts J2 about what she had done. J2 says she just wants to tell J3 the truth and that what happened afterward is just an accident. George finally asks if she's jealous of J3. But instead of answering, she just questions him back and asks why can't he just keep working on her, pointing out that she also wants to be better. Pissed, George shuts her down for a while and takes her legs. While working on the legs, he receives a call from Simone. She says that Archive Systems Incorporated thinks that George is using their technology for his own robots, threatening to sue Artisan Robotics for patent infringement. Although they try to cover for George, Simone intimidates him, saying that she will fully terminate his contract and let him face charges alone if the claim against him is true. After a while, George finishes the legs for J3 and begins to build the perfect form for her. He designs a very human-like figure that looks exactly like Jules. When J3 wakes up, she looks at herself in the cameras, admiring her new look. After that, she heads outside to go sightseeing and feels the surroundings. Meanwhile, back in the facility, George uses a temporary pair of legs for J2 and wakes her up after he installed it. J2 seems disappointed about George suddenly shutting her down and says she wants to go out. But on her first step, she immediately notices that her legs are different from before. This makes her disappointed even more when J2 realizes that he gave her legs to J3. George promises to give her a new pair of legs, but she tells him to leave her alone. J2 then goes to the waterfalls again. However, she is starting to run out of power, and on her way back, J2 collapses in the hallway. At the same time, George is having a good time with J3. He even gives her an artificial sandwich that she can eat to enjoy the feeling of eating. But they are interrupted by J1, who notifies them about J2. The two quickly attend to J2 and George requests to talk to her alone. When J1 and J3 are gone, George asks if she's okay. J2 says she's not, yet George doesn't see any damage to her. She insists on being still not okay, so George just tells her to come to talk to him when she's feeling fine. The next day, George and J3 bond more jogging and dancing with each other. All of this is happening while J2 is filled with sadness and jealousy. Thinking that George doesn't need her anymore, J2 destroys herself by drowning in the lake. Not long after, he notices that she's missing and starts looking for her. After several days of finding nothing, they just decided to bury J2's favorite things, including the VR game, in memory of her. Later that night, more memories of Jules start coming into J3's brain, like the time when Jules and George were cuddling. Because of this, she decides to lie beside George in his bed. But as soon as George wakes up, he's surprised to see her and orders her to get out of his room. Overwhelmed by Jules' memories, J3 screams in pain and collapses on the floor. When she wakes up, George asks how she's feeling, to which J3 replies that she remembers the crash. However, it surprises him more when J3 reveals that Jules was pregnant at that time. George immediately goes to Jules' archive and tries to call her, but he cannot reach her. Due to that, he calls Archive Systems Incorporated to tell them about the problem. According to the Archive's representative, in the case that the dead decide to go somnolent, they cannot do anything about it. George then argues that according to Vincent, everything is fine with Jules' archive. Hearing this name, the representatives say they don't have any employee named Vincent. As it turns out, the archive didn't send any team for a site visit to George's place. Worse, Simone calls George to notify him that the archive finds J2's body and confirms their allegations about him. They are now sending troops to arrest George and confiscate his works and robots. Thinking quickly, George goes out to destroy the power line to the bridge. At this time, J3 hears Jules' archive ringing. Answering it, J3 tells Jules that she doesn't need to worry about George anymore because she will take care of him. When George comes back, he sees J3 just putting the phone back. The phone then rings again, and George takes it immediately. Jules asks who she just talked to, but he says that it's not important. What's important is that they'll see each other again soon. Hearing this, J3 realizes that George just doesn't want her to become like Jules. Instead, he really wants J3 to be Jules by putting her entire consciousness in her body. Then all of a sudden, House alerts them that several aircrafts are coming. George orders House to close the door, but it cannot comply with his command. Remembering what happened before, George quickly opens the briefcase to enable the lockdown protocol of the facility. However, archive security teams still manage to break through the sealed doors. This distracts George, and J3 takes the opportunity to take the gun from the briefcase. Pointing the gun at him, she begs George to let Jules go. George just argues that he needs to try to get the real Jules back, and if they don't do it now, the archive will take J3 away. Realizing that there's nothing that can change George's mind, J3 agrees to transfer Jules' consciousness into her. Just then, the archive security reaches their room and begins to open it. Seeing this, they quickly start the operation, but J3 faints afterward. At this moment, the door finally opens, yet there's not a single person behind it. The ambiance of the facility suddenly becomes calmer, like it was never raided in the first place. When J3 wakes up, it seems like the transfer succeeded, and Jules is in her body now. Filled with happiness, the two hug each other. But to their surprise, Jules' archive suddenly rings. Looking at J3, she begs George not to answer it, but he still does. On the other line is Jules telling him that this will be their last call because she has been told that his system is going to expire soon. George gets confused about it and becomes speechless. He just listens to Jules telling him that she loves and misses him very much. And in this last call, a young girl calls him daddy and bids her goodbye to him, saying that she loves him. At this moment, it is revealed that during the accident, Jules was not the one who died, but George. He is the one inside the archive. What George has been experiencing is just a simulation in his mind. The scene then changes to the real world, where Jules and her daughter are looking at George's archive for the last time. There, Vincent gives his condolences to them and hands them some files. The movie ends with Jules and their daughter going out of the funeral, finally letting go of George. This movie just went from 0 to 100 real quick. If you're someone who is looking for a movie that is action-packed, with big risks at stake about AI like Ex Machina, Extinction, or Tau, this is not the movie for you. One might say the movie is pretty boring, but upon reaching the end, you will realize that all of it makes sense for the biggest plot twist in the end. The calm yet eerie feeling presented in the movie perfectly sets up the ending.